your book tells us how do we do this with our children, right? We read these stories, we talk about them in not a methodological way, but how do we as adults cultivate and train our moral imagination? Maybe we were deficient, right, in our growing up years. So how do we do that now as adults?
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, where we are cultivating the maximum number of thinking moms we can. This is the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scholé Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. To get my free, almost weekly, mostly Charlotte Mason newsletter, go to afterthoughtsblog.net/subscribe and sign up. My co-host today is Abby Wall. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Today's guest is Vigen Guroian. Until his retirement in 2015, Vigen Guroian was professor of religious studies and Orthodox Christianity at the University of Virginia. He is now a permanent senior fellow of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, senior fellow at the Center on Law and Religion at Emory University, distinguished fellow of the John Jay Institute, and senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He also is on the faculty of Memoria College online. Most importantly for our purposes, he is the author of a book we love and highly recommend, Tending the Heart of Virtue, How Classic Stories Awaken a Child's Moral Imagination. Did you sign up to do the 5x5 reading challenge this year? If so, you need to join the sistership as a Sophie membership and get the accountability you need and the support you want. With weekly check-ins and quarterly Zoom-style meetups, you will be encouraged to continue in good reading habits as well as get fun advice on which book to read next. Just go to scholesisters.com/sistership and join as a Sophie. That's scholesisters.com/sistership. Today's episode was such a delight to record. Abby and I had a great time discussing with Dr. Guroian truth and how it relates to fairy tales. You're going to love this conversation. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. We usually have 2 segments, and the first one, we call it our Scholé Every Day. We're sharing a book that we're reading.
I'd like to know what I'm reading right now.
You look like you have a couple books that you own.
But I'm reading one especially because I'm going to be teaching it for 5 weeks on a 5-week seminar for Memoria Press.
Wonderful.
And I've left it behind since my retirement in 67. Retirement, not really. And that happens to be the Brothers Karamazov.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh.
Which I think I've probably read 20 or 30 times.
Wow.
I'm not exaggerating.
That's amazing.
Looking at a 40-plus teaching career, and I had the whole of it in the classroom more than a dozen times. So I read it certainly 24 times because I never teach a book like that without having read it once already and then reading it with the class.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I was asked to give the description of the book, and my description wasn't really a description. It was to say that I wanted to return to a friend, an old friend, and that this old friend was the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's greatest novel, and that apart from the Bible, this book appeared in my courses more than any other book. So there it is.
Excellent.
And it's not surprising. I just pulled this off this bookshelf back here, that the Plough Publishing House, which publishes selections from writers and so forth and so on, published a book entitled The Gospel in Dostoevsky, Selections from His Works. foreword by Malcolm Muggeridge.
Ooh.
And why would that be? Because in Dostoevsky, the scriptures echo everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they elude most modern readers because they're not familiar enough with the Bible to hear it being echoed in Dostoevsky. But you can't go many pages in Dostoevsky without some echo of scripture. So it's not surprising that I've read Dostoevsky as many times as I have.
You make me think I should read him again. It's been a number of years since I've picked up that book.
Yes, well, it's 800 pages.
Yes.
Not an easy 800 pages.
It's a real commitment.
It is.
But I haven't looked at it for really closely for at least 8 years now.
Oh,
So
wow.
I sort of miss it. And I've forgotten a lot. I'm going to have to learn it all over again, but maybe a little bit differently this
Mm-hmm.
my life than when I was, say, 40 years of age. We sometimes forget, those of us who have read the Brothers Karamazov, that the principal actors, the protagonists in this story, are all in their late teens or 20s or children. What goes on in terms of amorous affairs and plotting and all kinds of psychological skirmishes is mostly between men and women that are under the age of 30. So when I read it when I was 40 years old, I was still sort of back there, but not at the age of 75. It's a little bit different.
That's interesting. I don't think I actually noticed that about the ages.
You forget
Mm-hmm.
how young the brothers themselves are. The oldest is Dmitri. What is he? He's, I think, maybe 25, 26. So they're young men, practically teenagers when you talk about Alyosha, who's the youngest. Is he a teenager? I'm forgetting if he's that young. He might be. Yeah.
Well, I wish I could take your class.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll see how many are brave enough to. There'll be quite a few, mostly auditing, listening,
Okay.
so much, but there'll be quite a few. That's what I suspect.
That's
Yeah,
exciting.
so that's the book I'm reading right now. I'm reading other books, but we won't mention those.
Well, we're always reading more than one book. I mean, I think as readers, we do. I'm not reading anything quite so highbrow, but I am reading a wonderful book with my teenage sons. So I am still homeschooling 3 of my boys, and I have twin 14-year-olds and then a 15, almost 16-year-old. And we discovered this wonderful book by Edna Hong, and it's called The Bright Valley of Love. It's a biography, or kind of a biography about a man named Gunther, and he was severely handicapped and kept in a room in his grandmother's back room and very neglected. And then they took him in. This book takes place in Germany right after World War I, and so he's taken to Bethel, which is a community that I think it's actually an organization that still exists to this day. And they take care of children who were severely disabled and had seizures and all of these things. But it is a Christian community, and these children are treated with such kindness and dignity and love. They are given an education, and they are just treated so wonderfully. And it was such a stark contrast from his grandmother barely giving him limited needs, and then he was taken out into the sunshine and told what things were. And he had this whole awakening in his mind that, while his body was completely crippled and couldn't do much, his mind was fully alive, but it had never even been spoken to other than a few words here and there. So my teenage sons won't listen to this, so I'll throw them under the bus, as it were. But we barely could get through a chapter about Christmas because it was the first time he had ever experienced anything like that. And the story of the Christ child and the beautiful boughs of cedar that were brought in and the candles and the story of Christmas and this amazing awakening of this child, and then also loss and death, and what happens when, one of his friends goes and is so sick and doesn't make it to Christmas, but that while my boys and I are sitting there like trying to wipe away tears because it's so
Oh,
touching, how this beautiful story portrays that we don't actually have to be sad because his friend is going into eternity and he is going to be made whole and new. And so it has been such a wonderful story, and we're only about halfway through, but the next part of the story that it says on the back cover is that this is right at the beginning of the rise of the Nazi Party. And one of the things that they're trying to do is, will this group of people who takes care of, these mild to severely disabled people, are they going to be able to, like 2,000 of them live in this, area, this little valley? Are they going to be able to escape the Nazi regime and coming in to exterminate them, because they were definitely not part of the master race? So it's a true story, and this man Gunther actually lived, and he learned to sing and praise the Lord, and it's just this wonderful, wonderful story, and it's actually really well written. So the author actually met Gunther and interviewed him and just wanted to tell his
wow.
story. So it is truly a fantastic book. And my kids, it's been a long time since my kids are, like begging me to read more of a book to them aloud. So it's been,
You read to all of them aloud.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Just certain types of the day we read a few things together. But this is the one that they're not rushing off. They're like, no, just one more chapter, Mom. We can put off math a little longer. Like, just let's do it. Usually they're like, no, let me go get my schoolwork done. But this book is just challenging them. And then I've heard them tell their friends about this story. They told their older sister about it, who is not at home right now. Like, she's at home, but she's doing other schoolwork outside of the home. And so she's like, well, I need a copy of this book and I need to read it. And so it's been a really great thing. And we were telling my husband about it on our car ride down, and the kids are just telling him about all these things. And we're all laughing at each other while we're crying because,
Aw.
we got big, tough boys, and we can't cry about things. So they were teasing each other, but we are just really had a hard time getting through the Christmas chapter.
Young people that age will be engaged by stories in which our humanity is at stake in one
Yes.
fashion. When I had actually completed my doctoral dissertation in that spring. I taught for a full semester at a high school in Richmond, Virginia, and I had there was a TV show where the class was called the Sweat Hogs, and they were the worst of them. And the man whom I replaced for that semester actually had to have psychiatric care.
Oh,
That's
wow.
why he was out. Okay. Crazy things happened in that classroom. I got a knife pulled out at me, all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
But the way I caught their attention and got them engaged was to read to them. This was junior class. So they were what, 16, 17? Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago.
Mm.
And they became totally enraptured. I mean, they just were totally engaged in that. And again, it had to do with, I think, the circumstances of those individuals in the camps in the Soviet Union at the time, and where Solzhenitsyn himself spent many years. So I'm not surprised at that. Those are good stories for people that age.
Yes.
Well, I think I'm going to buy a copy of that book and read it to my teenagers because it sounds like one that would be good for them.
Mhm.
All right.
Well, the book that I am reading is a history book. It's called Pax. It's War and Peace in Rome's Golden Age by Tom Holland. And I'm not super far into it, so I can't say a lot about it, but I love Roman history. And this is the first time I've ever read anything by Tom Holland, but I know that Rome is one of his areas that he really focuses on. I think this is his third book. on Rome and the Roman Empire. So this one starts with Nero in the year 69.
Mm.
And so it's going to go through, I believe, things like the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and all of that kind of stuff. But one of the things I appreciated was in the preface, he talked about how the Romans are obviously they're humans. So there are things that we have in common with them, but they're very strange to us and the way that they think and the priorities that they have and what's important to them. And he's trying to write the book so that we understand from a Roman perspective what they were thinking and what was going on and what they were doing. And I mean, a lot of the Roman history I've read is actually just things like Plutarch or Tacitus, or I mean, just like original source type stuff. But when I've read books that are by historians talking about Rome, a lot of it has been, I feel like seeking what is in common, which I don't think that's a problem, but I'm very interested to read a historian who wants to talk about how they're different from us. And so he sees them as peculiar and thinks that we can only understand them if we start from the position that we really don't think like them. So I've never read anything quite like it. I'm looking forward to it. I read the preface. The preface was very good. And then I'm about, I don't know, a third or a half of the way through the first chapter. And so far, he's really just establishing a brief arc of the history where he starts out with, Romulus through Tarquin, which was when they had kings, and then talks about how they had this republic and then how they ended up all the way at someone like Nero. Like, how do you get to that place from this glorious republic? So far, I would say I can recommend it in the sense that it's well written and it is super interesting, and he's putting some of the pieces together of things that I've wondered. So we'll see how it goes.
You chose a book like that subject matter.
I've taught Plutarch for years to
Plutarch.
junior high and high schoolers. And so I just love Roman history. I didn't know what I was doing when I started. I was at a co-op for homeschoolers and they just needed someone to teach it. So I volunteered and figured, we'll just figure this out. But now, 12 years later, I find them fascinating. So
In what context did you teach Plutarch?
it was just a homeschool co-op.
Uh-huh. Were you reading his poetry or were you reading his?
We were reading his lives, his Greek and Roman lives. So we were reading, basically, I would go with it. I would go through lives with them very slowly. So we would spend the fall going through one life and the spring going through another. So we did 2 a year, every year for basically 12 years until I moved to Texas. So,
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah.
I love teaching Plutarch
Me too.
to little 13-year-old boys who all of a sudden get very passionate on their opinions about Greeks and Romans. It's the cutest thing I've ever seen. And it's the first glimpse of what they will be like as men, like when they start to really grab onto things that are important. And so I try not to laugh at them because I think they're so endearing, but I don't want them to think I'm not taking them seriously, because I am. I just love them. So anyway, it's a great age.
Yes, it is.
Hi, Abby here to invite you to join us in Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to talk about all things homeschool, educational philosophy, books, and how to avoid burnout. Sistership is private and free from ads, free from drama, and free to join. We wanted a place, no matter where we live, to find thinking mothers to discuss ideas, to become equipped and confident, and to not take ourselves too seriously. Sistership will encourage you to read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully all that you are learning. So, join us for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
We're very excited to have you here because we wanted to discuss with you your book, Tending the Heart of Virtue, which I read the first edition at least 10 years ago. I'm trying to think of, my oldest is 21. I'm trying to think about how young he was when I read it. I mean, he might have actually been 9 or 10. So it's probably more like 12 years ago. But now obviously you have a second edition out.
Yes.
But before we really get in on the discussion of what we wanted to talk with you about, I was wondering if you would briefly tell us, just for people who aren't familiar with the first edition and the second edition, what is even the difference between the two?
Well, the first edition had what, I think 5 chapters. This one has 8 chapters, 9.
Mhm.
There was a decision I had to make at some point because people had asked me whether I would write a second book like it.
Mhm.
I mean, the first edition has been translated into Portuguese and Romanian,
Oh,
actually.
wow.
Interesting combination, isn't it? The second edition has 3 additional chapters. It's a half again as long as the first edition.
Yeah, you actually have 9 chapters in your new edition,
9 chapters. I can't
Mm-hmm.
remember what I have in front of me. Yes. Okay. So it's 9 chapters.
as do I.
I think it's 8 stories, though, right? That's probably
Yeah.
what you were thinking of.
Well, yeah. I discussed this with my editor at Oxford. She suggested writing a second edition. I always thought that probably was the thing to do because the thesis of the book that I cover in the introduction and the first chapters in the first edition is one that attracted a lot of attention
Mm-hmm.
by people. And, it's been 25 years since the first edition came out. So there's a whole new generation of readers, mothers, parents, that I did not want them to miss what was in the first edition. So I decided to just write a second edition without making it overly weighty. I mean, it's still just short of 300 pages.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want it to be any bigger than that. I wanted to be able to give people a book that they could hold in their hands and it not be clumsy. And so that's what I did. I did some revising of several of the chapters, not heavy revision, and I added to the introductory chapters a little bit, and it's doing fabulously well for a second edition. It's moving its way as if it were a first edition, and that's what I wanted to see happen. And that's the difference. It's just a weightier book. There's more discussed, more chapters. I added a chapter on 2 of Anderson's stories.
Yes.
The one that's most familiar, The Ugly Duckling,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe one of his 2 or 3 best stories, really. The second story that I discuss is The Nightingale. I did not include a Grimm's story in the first edition, and that's deceiving because I've spoken on Grimm's in many places,
Hmm.
whether it's Snow White or Hansel and Gretel, and certainly Cinderella, which I think is a far superior story to Perrault's version, which is the version that Disney popularized and which most Americans identify as Cinderella. So I have a chapter on Cinderella, an almost novella-length short story by John Ruskin, The King of the Golden River, which is a marvelous tale.
Oh, it's one of my favorites.
And it's one of the first of the Victorian fairy tales. He wrote it right in mid-century, 19th century, as a young man at the age of, he was 21,
Oh, wow.
22 years old, at a challenge to write a story. Challenged by a young lady, young girl, I guess she was maybe 7, 8 years younger than he was, who became his wife later on.
Oh, really?
Yes, and Ruskin did not want to publish this story. He wrote it for her. She said, "You think you're so smart." He'd already won poetry prizes and was writing writing on art, which became one of his most ambitious enterprises, his writing on art and architecture. But she said, "I bet you can't write a story the way the Grimms wrote a story." Well, he did. He wrote it in a month and a half or so, and he never liked it. He said, I can't write fairy tales," but he did. He wrote one of the great fairy tales. And it was actually Effie, his wife, and Ruskin's father who conspired to have it published 10 years after he wrote it in 1850. So that's juxtaposed to Cinderella for reasons I can go into if you want to ask, but I explain at the beginning. He is a kind of Cinderella type, the character Gluck. But it wasn't so much that he's a Cinderella type that intrigued me. The chapter is called The Goodness of Goodness. And it was just the exceptional goodness of these two characters, Cinderella and Gluck, that interested me. And the relationship of goodness to happiness, genuine happiness. That's what I was really interested in.
Mm.
It doesn't hurt that he is a Cinderella type. And the last story that I discuss in the final chapter is one that I tried tackling so many times. It took me 2 years to write it, really. I mean, not that I wrote every day. It took me 2 years. And that chapter is on obedience and the path to perfection. And it's one of George MacDonald's great stories, The Wise Woman, sometimes called The Lost Princess. Not liked by the literary critics, but loved by the right people, such as C.S. Lewis. I think that story deserves to be brought before children again in a way that it has not for some time. So that's what I added. A lot of text, a lot of good stuff, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that MacDonald story is the only one on your list that I have not read yet.
Mm.
I've read a number of MacDonald books to my children aloud over the years, but that one, I'm not even sure if we own it. I'm going to have to go look because I'm going to have to buy so many books after this episode.
Yeah.
Maurice Sendak was critical of this story in a way that he was also critical of Pinocchio.
Really?
The first chapter in which I discuss a story is on Pinocchio in the first edition. There is a sense in which I was thinking of bookends when I wrote this. When I put this at the end, the bookends being the chapter on Pinocchio and this chapter on the Wise Woman. And conveniently, perhaps, Maurice Sendak disliked Pinocchio about as much as he disliked the Wise Woman. Maybe he disliked the Wise Woman even more.
Oh, wow.
Well, let me read to you what he had to say. Whatever the case may be, Sendak describes the Wise Woman as, and I quote, a harsh, angry tale whose magic, unlike the crystal clear fantasy of MacDonald's earlier stories, is black, erratic, and appears finally to be nearly impotent against the forces of evil. There is a falling off, he adds, not of creative power, but rather of faith and moral power. He's completely wrong about this story. And thank goodness that Lewis had something really positive to say about it. So he ranked it among MacDonald's greatest stories, along with Phantastes, the Curtis book, The Golden Key, and Lilith. And I promise you, it's about becoming a real human being, just as Pinocchio is a story of a similar kind.
One of the big things we were hoping that you would address, it's an issue that comes up in homeschooling. I don't know if it comes up in the larger world, but we over the years have encountered many, many homeschoolers that have a very narrow definition of truth. And so they believe that all truth is propositional. It's like it needs to be this sentence that can fit into this neat and tidy logical syllogism, and then they can just evaluate it in this really simple black and white sort of way. And so the homeschoolers that fall into that category, they don't really have a conception of conveying truth in a story form. And so these kinds of stories can make them really uncomfortable.
Yes.
So you end up then with two responses, and one just rejects those stories as being untrue. And they even go so far sometimes as to dispense with all fiction, and they just read, history or science or that kind of thing. But then the other type, I feel like they lower what these stories are because they just kind of say, oh, it's just a harmless, fun story written for kids. They don't think that there's anything really to it.
Well, you're right on the mark. I know what kind of reader you're talking about.
Okay.
Kind of parent or individual you're talking. Yes.
So I mean, I would just love for you to explain how there can be such a thing as truth that's conveyed without a clear, explicit truth statement. Because I think that's where we get mixed up. We want everything to be for God so loved the world that instead of, there's also poetry in the Bible, but we forget that when we start to read these other things. So I would just love for you to address the issue.
Yeah. It's hard to discuss this with the kinds of individuals you're speaking of. They're in earnest.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There's a citation from C.S. Lewis that I think is a way of entering into this. I wrote it down ahead of time, and I have it memorized, but he wrote once that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning.
Mm.
That's a beginning. I think these individuals, in some sense, think of God as a rational God and that alone. And yet, St. Basil the Great, Caesarea in the 4th century, wrote that God imagined the world into existence.
Mm.
I'm more apt to believe that that's the case, that he reasoned it into existence or merely thought it in the narrow sense of thought being reason alone.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think the other person that I've learned a great deal from is Flannery O'Connor, one of the great 20th century writers of fiction.
Yeah.
Flannery wrote, "The whole story is the meaning because it is an experience and not an abstraction."
Mm.
So the temptation to reduce a story to a truth, or as you put it, a proposition, is about as wrong-headed as you can get about what story is and what the importance of story is, particularly to children. Because for children, stories supply exactly that, an experience that they're not able to have because of their age, and that they're not in the world completely. But they need to be prepared for that world, and they need to be able to imagine what their lives might be in such a world.
Mm.
And they need help with that. And stories are at the heart of it. If you deprive children of stories, you seriously injure them.
Mm.
Or maybe it's just deprive, but then deprive becomes injure them. So, and stories cannot be reduced to propositions. They can be, but it's not the story any longer. It's not the experience any longer. The worst thing you can do, and it was done over and over to me as a student, was I was asked, what is the main thesis in the story?
Mm.
That's the worst thing to ask a child. If you want that story to really impact that child's mind and imagination, and let's not fool ourselves. Imagination is as much definitive of a human being as reason is. Perhaps more so, actually. And I've tried to argue that in the book.
Yeah.
That thesis,
Mm-hmm.
the moral imagination, and so forth. So it's hard to persuade people of the kind of viewpoint they have, that they need to actually experience the story as story. They begin by reading with the intention of unshelling the story. That is to say, it's like a peanut. There's something in the middle that is what you want to taste and have for yourself, but you throw away the narrative, which is the shell. Well, the narrative is not the shell, it's the whole thing. And the only way that you can persuade people of this is by taking them through story in the manner in which I've tried to do over and over again in dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of workshops and seminars with parents and teachers over the years. This book has taken me everywhere over the last 25 plus years. And that's what I do. I'm not going to walk into a workshop and teach them the method of reading a story and getting the meaning out of it. I have to open their minds, their imaginations, in order for them to learn how then to teach a story. But then most of what teaching is about is not teaching, it's learning.
Hmm.
We learn people. We don't teach them.
Hmm.
On that point, what if you are teaching these seminars and things like that, and you are learning people, right? You're awakening them.
Awakening, exactly. That's the subtitle of my book, isn't it? Awakening the Moral Imagination.
Mhm.
Yeah. So maybe some of our listeners didn't grow up that, or they grew up on the Disney-fied versions of these things. My childhood had both. I had Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales and great books, but we also did a ton of Disney because my family was,
Yes.
very secular
I
and
apologize for that. I was there.
yeah, well, that's what it is.
I was there in the 1950s and 60s when Disney introduced a Disney World.
Yeah.
And I
Oh, wow.
do it every Sunday, right? Although I found the Disney that I enjoyed the most was actually biography, Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or whatever.
Yes.
Mhm.
They were heroes.
Yeah.
And Disney tied into the middle class when the middle class was really beginning to come into its own in America after the Second World War. He was right with it. And so I went outside and I played Daniel Boone or Robin Hood
Mhm.
or Davy Crockett. Those were my heroes. And that took me into biography of other kinds, actually. So Disney had a genius that his corporation that has his name still has not a whit of, but that's another matter.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So true.
So you're running these seminars and things like that. Your book tells us how do we do this with our children, right? We read these stories, we talk about them in not a methodological way, but how do we as adults cultivate and train our moral imagination? Say we are in that, maybe we were deficient, right, in our growing up years. So how do we do that now as adults?
This is a conundrum. If you're not raised with stories, then your mind hasn't been awakened, as Plato would say.
Mm.
Mhm.
So it's that much more difficult in adulthood to learn people to appreciate stories for what they are, not for a concept or a principle that they're seeking to inculcate in their children, or even a value. I analyze value. I'm not interested in values. Values are like smoke rings. And initially they have and I say this in the book, initially they're circular and they have a shape, and then they sort of dissipate into the air. That's what values are like. It's virtues I'm interested in and character I'm interested in. And that's the end of education. The end
Yes.
of education is not learning the conceits and imaginings of the present. That's not what it is. It's not learning how to read and write. That's not education either. Education is education of character, or it's nothing. And you're not going to educate character by presenting children with precepts.
Mm.
They can use precepts in all sorts of ways. If they don't have the right character, they can use it to lie. They can use those precepts to lie just as much as to tell the truth. So it's character. That's what education is.
Yep. We would agree with you. We often say that education is for virtue, right? We are.
It's not learning how to read and write and do arithmetic. We talk about that's a cliche that leads us nowhere, really.
Mhm. To say it's about those skills is the same kind of mindset as saying it's about getting into a certain college or having a certain job. Those kinds of things, from reading and writing and doing arithmetic all the way to being able to provide for your family,
Yes.
are a result of having been educated often, but we can't conflate it with the purpose.
Well, been educated, yes. More like trained.
Mm.
Been trained to prosper, shall we say,
Hmm.
materially and in terms of notoriety or achievement, a measure of worldly standards, yes. That's what education has become. There are very few colleges of the liberal arts that are intact as liberal arts colleges any longer.
Right.
And liberal arts is being swept out of state institutions. And in point of fact, given the way things are right now, only the state institutions are going to survive.
Oh.
The small colleges are going to disappear. Most of them deserve to disappear because they gave up their purpose in the first place. But it's a sad thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was going to say something more directly to the question you raised, but I don't know. Look, I was going to say this about the way I wrote these chapters. I did not write them in a way that the expectations of people who want to get the kernel out of what I have to say will find it.
Mm.
So I'm very true to the stories. I stick with the stories. I do not leave them behind. I do not conceptualize in that manner. I do not abstract. Much of literary criticism may do that.
Yeah.
And much of what is on the internet, where there's summarization of stories and so forth, does that. But I don't do that. I keep telling the story. Oh, yes. I tell it in the form of a midrash, an interpretation which is telling the story in a manner in which the truths in that story come to light, perhaps more so than if the story were left alone, right? And that's an old tradition. That's the old tradition of how to read the Bible, starting with the originators, the creators of the scripture, Jews, the Hebrews. That's the way they learn the Bible, still learn it. We've abandoned much of that, and it has not been helpful. Let's put it that way. I've taught the Bible a whole lot over the years. I had to, particularly when I was at Loyola College. And I never want to leave it behind, but most of the stories that I treat, you would argue, are fairy tales, where mystery and magic have a role. Now, I know some folks, as soon as they hear the word magic, they think it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you something. Magic in genuine fairy tales is an analog of grace, or in a world, in a subcreation, as Tolkien said, which is in story form. Grace in the positive, to be sure, but also grace in the negative, or not grace, but rather the inversion of grace. Magic can be the inversion of grace, and it is in fairy tales. It can be. But if there's no magic in a story, it's not likely that it's a fairy tale. The second would be mystery. Fairy tales don't add up, deliberately so, because they leave us with a sense of awe or mystery. We want to fathom more than we do at the present. It invites us into another dimension of thought, which is imaginative. It's an invitation to the imagination that we should exercise more than we do. Although, as I argue, there's no loss of imagination, there's no lack of imagination in our culture. Mostly it's the wrong kind of imagination, idolatrous imagination to begin with. All kinds of other imagination that is not helpful to our humanity. We are imaginative creatures. But we go back to the conundrum. If you're not raised with stories, you haven't been acquainted with them in a way that you can live with them immediately. I mean, I run into that all the time. And that's the challenge in bringing a fairy tale to a class of teachers, for example, a group of teachers. What do I do with this story? That's the question I often ask. I don't know what to do. What do you do with Little Red Riding Hood? The other problem is that we have the misconception that the fairy tales in particular are just for young children. Young children enjoy the story, but the fairy tales ought to be taught in high school as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what if you get a later start on fairy tales? Should we still be making time and put that as a priority?
I taught a course on religion and children's literature for 25 years. The last year I taught it at the university, I limited it to 30 students. because I wanted it to function more or less as a seminar, and I would talk off of the papers that I assigned regularly. So they were writing 7 or 8 short papers and 1 or 2 lengthy papers a semester. It was not a gut course. But the last year I taught it at UVA, there were 30 in the classroom and 150 on the wait list.
Wow.
And there would have been more. At a certain point, you look and say, there's 150 on the wait list. I'm not going to put myself on there. It's no use whatsoever. But the point is that, yes, you can open in the eyes of 20-year-olds to the value of these stories, and they're informative to our very being human, even at that age, especially in some cases at that age.
Are they in that class or in some of those classes with these young adults? Are they the same stories that you touch on in your book, or did you have some that you prioritized for that particular age group?
Every story that I discuss in the book, I've brought into the classroom.
Sure. Yeah.
And I started doing that when my children basically didn't want to hear me read stories to them all the time. On occasion, they would. Okay. And there were other things that were occupying their minds.
For sure.
So I took it into the classroom, the college classroom. I didn't want to leave them behind. I wanted to live with them. And so I brought them into the classroom. So maybe it was a bit of a selfish thing to do, but it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. It proved a point that these stories are not just for 5-year-olds, for the nurseries per se. In fact, the other thing I've argued is that I've talked a lot to classical schooling faculty in particular, and they're binomial, which is scripture and Greco-Roman mythology. That's the binomial. My argument is that the binomial isn't sufficient. It should be scripture, myths, and fairy tales. Fairy tales are as ancient as either of the other two, and there's a wisdom in them that belongs to humanity that we shouldn't ignore and leave out. And so in classical schooling, the same mistake is made. If fairy tales, I'm not talking about the novel-length children's stories, which have a fairy tale character, but the stories of the Grimms and Andersen and Perrault and others, those fairy tales, they have a character that is as important. Here's something that some of your listeners might find puzzling, if not offensive. The Gospels read like fairy tales, or maybe the fairy tales read like the Gospels. They're very similar. And of course, Lewis argued that the Gospels were the culmination of what the fairy tale was. They were really true. They were brought down to earth. The truth was brought down to earth through the incarnation. So should it be surprising that the mysterious and the incomprehensible should be cast in the language of a fairy tale, perhaps, where you can't make all the connections, or you're left wondering? And if you expect the Gospels to be finely crafted narratives which are reducible to principles, they're not. You can't get rid of them and experience the truth in them. You have to live with them. You'll have to live inside of them. And fairy tales invite the very same thing for children and adults. 8th graders need the fairy tales at least as much as the 5th graders. In fact, if you read the Grimm's Cinderella, if an 8th grader reads Grimm's Cinderella, there's so much more there that he or she are able to grasp or hold on to. Or these are complex stories. They may look simple, but they're not.
Yeah.
Were they even originally written for children? I feel like we relegated them to childhood, but was that actually what they were intended for?
No, Not in the oral tradition, certainly, not as they were spoken orally. Remember, the Grimm's collected these the oral tradition, and out of that oral tradition, they actually wrote these stories. You cannot explain them apart from the fact that the Grimm's collected versions of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
But these are masterpieces. They're masterpieces. They're not just mere transcription of oral tradition, but there's a genius in the Grimms in being able to bring to us through their storytelling ancient tradition, the tradition of being a human being in a world which is not a flat screen,
Yeah.
a world which has depth and transcendence. They were able to do this. Anderson, many of his stories are his own creation.
Yeah.
But he was raised with the fairy tales and scripture. I mean, he learned to read from the Bible. He knew the Bible about as well as any writer that you can come up with. Same thing with Dickens, for that matter, who wrote fairy tales for adults, shall we say. Many of his novels are really in a fairy tale form, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's true.
And he loved fairy tales. And I've argued and pointed out in the second edition that he was absolutely appalled by what the publishing industry was doing with fairy tales, even in his day, which was Bowdlerizing them, retelling them in order to make a point. In this case, it had to do more with not prohibition, but what's the word I want?
Temperance, right?
Yeah,
Is it temperance? Yeah, the temperance movement.
Yes. And the fairy tales today are Bowdlerized and rewritten with similar ideological interests.
Oh yeah, there's a whole movement of all sorts of ridiculous things. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he wrote an article that he published in which he just railed against what was going on. He would not be happy today either. But he said, if you retell these stories the way you're retelling them, we'll forget the real stories. And that will be enormous damage to our culture. He used that term, to our culture.
Maybe that's the biggest danger with the Disney retellings, is that we forget the originals.
Yes.
I know I did. I didn't read the originals of most of the stories until I was a homeschool mom in my 20s.
Well, you don't even have to read the stories, you see. Cinderella is the Cinderella which Disney depicts, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, when I read Pinocchio for the first time, and I had only grown up ever watching Disney, I mean, it was shocking. Like, is this for children? I'm reading it aloud with my kids for the first time.
They love it. They love it.
Yeah, they loved it.
The cricket. Wham!
Yeah. And we stayed away from Disney. I mean, I think they've probably seen some things now, but I was like, you cannot watch The Little Mermaid. That's a terrible story about a girl disobeying her father and the real story is so much better. So anyway.
I would say that Disney's Pinocchio is an art form. I mean, yes, I don't know that Disney intended for it to be a substitute for reading Pinocchio.
True.
Because Disney was raised on fairy tales, and you can tell where Disney had a hand in it. Disney preserved a sense of mystery and wonder and hard truth in Pinocchio, for example. Pinocchio is not the same character as Collodi's Pinocchio. Collodi's Pinocchio is an Augustinian bad boy. He's original sin. He's made out of a piece of wood that is already naughty, shall we say.
That's so true. My kids were so mad at Pinocchio all the time.
Yeah. Yep.
Keeps getting himself into trouble. But the kids also want to see how he's going to get out of that trouble, which is they're caught in that. Disney's Pinocchio is a kind of an American innocent, is what he is. He's a lovable sort of fellow, in spite of in spite of his waywardness. You can't quite say the same thing about Collodi's Pinocchio.
Mm-mm.
Feel his pain for sure. Oh, the mythology and the scripture that's behind it, that I try to point out. I mean, my goodness, he gets hung on a tree, right?
Right.
Goes into the belly of a fish.
That belly of the fish. He's drowned and comes up no longer a donkey, but a puppet at least, who has a possibility of becoming a human being again.
Yeah.
Is mourning what he takes to be the death of the blue-haired fairy is absolutely moving. In fact, one time I read it to a group of college students, and they started to weep. There were obviously children. They're young people who in their childhood or through their years had experienced loss in a way that Pinocchio was giving expression to, as Collodi wrote it, which you won't find in Disney.
No.
Right. But I think that Disney's Snow White is an work of genius.
Yeah.
It's actually much closer to the original story, than anything else, I think, that he did. I don't know. There may have been one or two others. But what you find when you mentioned The Little Mermaid, well, that's, yeah, Disney's genius isn't there. It's just cheap romance, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
It's sentimentalism that's almost nauseating, in my view, and it's not high literature by any stretch.
No.
Totally wrong-headed. But that's when Disney is no longer an influence on Disney.
Yeah. Well, and I just think of The Little Mermaid and the sacrificial part that just gets completely ignored in the Disney version. There is no sacrifice. There is no real love. Yeah, like you said, sentimental and cheap romance. So yeah.
When our listeners listen to this episode, I think a question they're going to have is, what do I actually do tomorrow in my homeschool? So I own fairy tales. Do I just sit and read with my children? Are there certain things that I can do to help my children process these things, or is that even a goal? Do you have any advice for those of us who are, just spending our days with our children? I know, even though my kids are teenagers, I spend a lot of time still reading aloud to them. I know Abby does too. So I feel like there's definitely room in our lives to make adjustments if there are things that maybe I'm forgetting to do, in these teen years.
Well, at the risk of being self-patronizing in some sense, that's why I wrote the book. I think that even in reading a story to a child, if you have a deeper grasp of it, it will sound better even. And certainly if you're going to lead a child through a story, if one is secure in one's understanding of the story, that is extremely helpful, because it probably means if you understand the story, you're probably going to love it. You don't understand it, you're not going to love it. You may be interested, it may be curious, but you're not going to love it. And I think a love for the story is important. That it's important for parents to have a love for these stories, and so they have to be, in some sense, learned in them. And that's what I tried to do by writing the book, to give parents some confidence that they have insight into the story. I warn against, in the next sentence, being didactic for that reason. You don't have to communicate your level of understanding to a child. In fact, you're going to do so at some risk at going right over the child's head, boring the child, or confusing the child. No, you lead the child through the story. You wait for the child to ask questions, I think, is more important than asking questions of the child. And if they don't ask questions, it doesn't mean that it's not registering. I also believe that you should read these stories more than once to your children.
Yeah.
And in some proximity, these readings to one another, not waiting 6 months later or something, but in some proximity, so that they have a familiarity with the story and it becomes something that they consider in their own thoughts and their own imaginings. That's important. But I think the main issue is that we don't know how to read these stories anymore, leave aside understand them.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do by example in the book. By example, I'm trying to show you how to read a story. I've told my classes that year after year. I said, by example, as I'm in the classroom, I'm giving you an example right in front of you of how to enter into these stories. You're hearing me, you're seeing me go through these stories. And that is an example I'm setting for you consciously. I think it will be helpful to you. It's much more helpful than simply saying, okay, here are the 3 main points in the story, and now we're done with it.
Mm-hmm.
Education today in America has left us ill-equipped to really be the kind of reader that we need to be for our children.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer to that. I'm gratified that the book has helped as many as it has. And that was my purpose in it. I suppose in a more selfish way, I wanted to understand how I was interpreting these stories, the nature of my own reading of these stories, a kind of exercise in self-understanding, I guess. But no, there's no easy answer to the question you've asked, and that people who are listening to this, parents might be listening to this, or teachers might be listening to this. There's no easy answer to the questions that they often raise about, well, how do you do it?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do it? You do it by practice. There's
Yeah.
no other way.
No.
I practiced. I told you, I probably read the Brothers Karamazov 30 times.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird.
Well, we think it's great.
But each reading is an experience.
Mm-hmm.
I never get tired of that novel. If it's a great novel, if it's great literature, you will never get tired of it.
True.
It will always be informing you in ways that are unexpected, reading after reading.
All of our kids probably had books, like picture books, that they loved to have read and reread. And I just had a policy that I would only read things that I also enjoyed over and over and over again. And so we did have a lot of repeats, but they were very select, like, no, mom won't read that one. We know that, that's
So joy and communicate it to the child is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Joy of the adult in reading to the child is extremely important. There has to be joy in reading.
yes, there does.
I mean, and so much of our education makes it a labor.
Yeah.
No
Mm-hmm.
joy in it. It's joyless. Dickens in his novels rails against this. It's instrumentalist, it's utilitarian.
Yep.
He had it all down.
The facts, right?
The facts.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. He knew he was up to it.
Yeah.
Strange dude, mind you. He would walk for hours. He would walk right out of London and walk all night. I imagine that's how he wrote his novels. He was out there walking for hours and hours. Hard to imagine, but that's what he did. He wasn't sitting at a desk. He was walking. He kept walking. We should walk more too, I suppose.
I was just thinking that.
I walk a lot.
Well, my daughter's middle child, 10 years old, I'm telling you, he's something of a prodigy. I just don't know what to do with him. But he will make his mind up that he's going to write a story. But he goes outside and he thinks the story up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a habit in a 10-year-old. He will go outside. He'll disappear from the house. Everything will be going on inside. Where is he? Well, he's outside walking around the house. He'll be out there for half an hour. Then he comes in and he starts typing. Yeah.
I can't wait to see what he writes someday.
I know.
I could show you something and you'd be, I might send it to you if you give me.
Yeah, do
Okay,
it.
go for it.
I want to buy his first book.
There you go. Have you ever read, it's a more modern fairy tale, but I actually really love it. It's by Catherine Patterson, The King's Equal.
No, of course, I know Catherine Patterson. I'll tell you, when I was looking for people to blurb at the back of the book, I wrote Catherine Patterson.
Oh, really?
She wrote back, very kind. She said, I just don't do this.
Hmm.
Well, her book, The King's Equal, I would say is about virtue, and it is in the tradition of, I don't know, real fairy tales, not the modernized, like you were saying, versions, but
The King's.
The King's Equal. Yeah. Yep. And I read a story about it, which is why I picked it up. But there was a teacher and she was in a low income, poverty kind of stricken school district. And she had to teach English as a second language school or class. And, some of these kids they were trying to get them to, do their homework in this. And she thought, well, these kids need a story that they can fall in love with, that they can really, and they come from rough backgrounds, a lot of crime and all these things. And so she read this King's Equal to them, and they had copies. And this class of middle schoolers, I think, and maybe high schoolers just transformed. And she did it through the power of story. And so I immediately bought myself a copy of The King's Equal, and it's like tattered at this point. I probably need to get like a hardback copy if they're available, because we have read it so many times. But it is a wonderful story that I think everyone should read.
Not in print any longer, you think?
I don't know if it is or not. It's been so long, and I've just been reading it. I teach an art class, and so I read it. I read them last week, The Velveteen Rabbit, and this next week is going to be The King's Equal. So I've been having them do art projects and listening to fairy tales. So the best.
The one thing I note in the second edition, particularly, is that what Dickens railed against in the mid-19th century persists. So picture books are a wonderful invention, I think, of our time, roughly. It only goes back 100 or 150 years. But so many of the fairy tales are adulterated. Almost, it's hard to find the fairy tale told with integrity in picture books.
Well, I think this one would pass your test, but you should look at it and then get back to me if I'm wrong.
Is that I've looked and have not found, though somebody tells me they did find one, a picture book of The Ugly Duckling that is the complete story.
Oh,
If not rewritten in certain ways. That needs addressing. I'm working with some folks who are maybe going to create a series where the integrity of those stories is intact. But it's another obstacle. The best way to get to the classic fairy tales is to find a volume there that, probably doesn't have pictures.
yeah.
Collection, a genuine collection.
Yeah. And you have a couple of those referenced in the last chapter of the book, which
That's not exhaustive by any stretch.
I'm sure it's not, but that can get people started. So for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there any last thing that you really want our listeners to know, or any last bit of encouragement you want to give them?
Well, just that we're starved for good stories in the culture. And it's a frightening thing in my view, because I think that stories communicate wisdom in a way that didactic prose cannot convey. And so it's important for us to read to our children and to get them in the habit of reading good literature. And it's an uphill battle right now, but it needs to be done. And you all are trying to do that, and many others are trying to do that. And I take heart in that. I think there are some wonderful things happening in education, that isn't happening necessarily in much of what is public education today. There's some leaven. Maybe it will bring some reform about that we need, but you can start at home.
Yeah.
Between your first edition, your audience for that group, and the new edition, so right now, do you see any big differences between those, your original audience? I mean, because now some of those.
Yes. I can answer that.
Okay, good.
I wasn't sure for whom I was writing 25 years ago. I was writing for people like myself who wanted to read to their children, bring the right stories to their children. I knew that. But where were they? I had some sense that there were homeschoolers out there. And some of the private schools were okay, and I knew that I might have an audience there. Classical schooling was hardly existent at the time that I wrote. So I really didn't know who my audience was. I had some sense that there were people out there, and I think homeschoolers were, if I could identify a group, I could identify homeschoolers. That's all I knew, really. As a college professor, I didn't know much more than that. Well, what happened in the interim is an explosion of not only homeschooling, but classical schooling. Goes back to the roots of, it's the way children were taught 100 years ago, and not even that long ago. It was emptied out, gutted after the Second World War. I was educated in the 50s and the 60s, and remnants of it still existed in the public schools. For example, you could find Latin taught. You could find a speech teacher and rhetoric being taught. That was gone by the 80s completely. But it was replaced by homeschooling and some years later. And so I know who my audience is now. I hear from that audience, and I've been with that audience for 25 years now. So I'm much more aware of for whom I'm writing than I was when I wrote the first edition. And it's really heartening. It was really a shot in the dark the first time around. There was no such thing as podcasts where I was teaching to talking to people who are instructing and helping parents to teach their children. Just didn't exist, right?
Right.
We're a lot better off in that regard. The sad part is that the public schools have taken a dive, and I just don't know how they can be reformed from inside. That's I just don't see how it can be possible given the forces at work. But there are other forces at work that are cultural forces that you're a part of. That's extremely important and encouraging. So keep it up. Okay?
Thank you. That's
Thank
very
you.
encouraging.
Yes.
God bless.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Please make sure you are following us in your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss our upcoming fantastic episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolasisters.com/SS137 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for a Sophie membership and go deep with your 5x5 challenge by finding some reading camaraderie. Go to scolasisters.com/sistership and sign up for the Sophie membership. Our next episode is another one we are super excited about. Misty and I chatted with Andrew Zwerneman on what seminar-style teaching is and how it relates to the larger scheme of classical education. You are going to love this one. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
I think Oxford did give us an advanced reader copy when the new edition came out. It was just a digital version, but I definitely prefer the real book so I can take notes and things. So
once we found out about it, we had to buy them.
Yeah, we do. But we don't mind buying books.
That's right.
I'll stop talking in a minute, but